is where the future lies, the hope lies. It is undoubtedly the silver lining in this COVID-19 induced dark cloud. That's a story you've possibly been hearing for some time now. There are several indicators which point in this direction. There are companies which are reporting an improvement in their sales, consumption and their numbers in rural India. The spread of coronavirus in these areas has not been as bad as was initially expected. In fact, the Reserve Bank of India has also spoken about how recovery will come from rural India. The question is, how fast can this recovery be and how can we sustain it? Can we look at this as an opportunity to reset how skewed our focus tends to be on development in urban pockets, which are highly concentrated, clustered, congested, and perhaps that's why you've seen the largest spread of COVID-19 in these areas as well? Is it time to sort of refocus where new investments should be made, where new policies should be directed, and how can we really sustain this kind of rural resurgence? That's the big issue that we're tackling now on the show. But before we move ahead and introduce you to our speakers, let's just take a look at how corporate India has given a thumbs up to the rural recovery.
It's Bharat in the driver's seat for the automobile sector. Companies across the board are shifting gears to the rural market for their next growth engine. The RBI agrees too and says in its latest annual report that rural demand has fared much better than urban demand. Tractor sales have picked up by over 38% in July, while contraction in the motorcycle sales have eased to 4.9% in July versus 35% in the month of June. Corporate India too is echoing the same sentiment when asked about their growth plans in the rural market.
Even in India, most of our sales were coming from top 8 cities. Now we are expanding to the hinterland. Just in the last 2 years, we have more than doubled our network, by the way.
Eicher reported an above-average demand from smaller cities, while demand in bigger cities continued to remain below average. Similarly, Mahindra & Mahindra too has said that the contribution by Bharat is at 62% now versus 50% before. Ramesh Iyer of Mahindra & Mahindra Finance says he sees a lot of buoyancy in the rural market and hopes to see more traction in the festive season.
Importantly, in the rural market, the sentiments drive the growth. And what are the sentiments that the rural consumers look for? If the current monsoon is good, they start using their stored money. So it's not that they don't have money. They always store it for future. And then they see if the going forward looks pretty positive, then they start to spend. And we are seeing that very clearly.
The question now is whether this demand will be sustainable. RBI in its report has flagged off that a fuller recovery in rural demand is being held back by muted wage growth. The migrant crisis and the associated employment loss is hampering growth further. So while government schemes like Manrega are keen to supplement income losses and boost demand, India will need to ensure the rural rebound is not stumped. With Shivangani Mishra, Vikram Oza in Mumbai for ET Now.
All right, to speak more on this, I'm joined now by Rahul Bajoria, who's the Chief India Economist at Barclays, and Sreejith Balasubramanian, who's Economist of Fund Management at IDFC AMC. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen, and thank you for speaking with us today. Mr. Bajoria, just let me get your view straight on the rural resurgence narrative and theme that we've been all talking and hearing about. The Reserve Bank of India in its recent annual report also talked about how consumption in urban areas had suffered a bigger blow than in rural areas, how demand had fared better than urban areas. Why do you think this is the case? Do you think it's because of the COVID pandemic spreading more slowly in rural India, or is it because it's just being calculated from a lower base?
Sure. So I would say it's largely a confluence of a lot of these factors, right? So coming into the COVID pandemic, if you remember, India was already kind of experiencing a bit of a slowdown, but that slowdown was largely centered, I would say, in the urban pockets of the country, given that, the rural production, whether we look at agriculture production or we look at prices, both of them were relatively elevated. So income growth was starting to sort of recover from 2018, 2019 onwards. And that trend never really broke. At the same time, the COVID pandemic, obviously hit the urban areas faster. Now there are signs that it is starting to move into the rural areas, but certainly the healthcare preparedness of various states, both rural and urban, has improved at the margin. And the final thing, which really made us feel a little bit more optimistic about rural consumption was the fact that most of the fiscal support that was laid out in the last 6 months was largely targeted at the rural population, right? So whether you talk about in-kind transfers of food, whether it was Manrega wage hikes, we saw a bunch of other schemes aimed at the unorganized sector. So a lot of these factors kind of came together, and which is what is probably has helped in supporting rural consumption at the margin. And we have not seen the kind of decline in activity as we have seen in the urban areas, which obviously had the bigger health crisis.
Mr. Balasubramanian, I'd like your take on how we can sustain this growth, and is it really sustainable? So now if you see the broad 3 or 4 themes that have come in, one is that rural India is not necessarily just, the agricultural sector. There's a lot more happening beyond that. Secondly, you've seen a mass migration or a large number of migrant workers move from the cities back to their hometowns, and you have the Manrega push, etc. So you're seeing a sudden surge of maybe wages there or the extent of employment. The question is, how can we sustain this? Will it be enough to sort of move the needle?
Right. I mean, you're right when you said actually, it's been agri that has been actually doing so well. But one needs to remember a few things that, agri is at the end of the day 17 to 18% of GDP, whereas in rural, for instance, is around 47%, less than half GDP is rural. And the agriculture sector particularly is doing well. There's no question about it, like Rahul just mentioned, because of a combination of factors. Both, because the sowing season is in progress, the kharif season is in progress, it will be followed by the rabi season. So it's been a natural absorber of rural, labor that has actually migrated, includes the migrated labor from urban as well. So that has been good. But like you mentioned, the real problem is the sustenance of it. Now, if you look at the nominal agri wages or the nominal rural agri and the rural non-agri wages, both of it, it was actually the growth was very slow towards particularly in 2018, 2019. And real wages obviously negative because your CPI rural is also quite high. So in such a situation where your wages are already not been growing very fast, you have a situation where there's a migration of labor from urban to rural. So what we believe is obviously that there'll be a wages problem. So we'll probably not have an issue now because the season in progress is absorbing that labor. So the employment looks good probably, but your wages growth will be hit, and therefore consumption, which is the next step, but not pick up to the level that you think it would in terms of what a recovery would, in a typical recovery of what you would see. That is the main thing that we need to differentiate. But that's it, the support from the government has been there. You look at the spending through the rural ministry, agri ministry, and if you look at the indicators like you just mentioned, tractor sales, and all of that, fertilizer sales, all of it is looking good. But the sustenance is a big issue. I don't think agri alone can bear the whole weight of the rural economy. Because for that you really need to understand the structure of the economy as well. Because there's a lot of non-agri households as well, which is actually of late. If you look at some of the surveys, it's actually a very dominant portion of the entire rural spectrum.
So what is happening in the non-agri rural section of the economy? Mr. Bajoria, I'd like you to come in on this part. What has sort of been the reason for the push from these sections, and are those factors some that can persist over the next few quarters?
So I think there are temporary factors, and there are certain long-term government programs which can help at the margin. Again, these are all mitigating factors. They as Sreejith said, you need more sustenance in it. But then programs like, say, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, when we look at the push for electrification, the push for kind of giving, microcredit programs where, you sort of try to support informal businesses. I think these are all areas where it can sort of improve upon the tailwinds that we have gotten out of the agriculture sector. But certainly, we are already seeing some signs of a lot of these drivers sort of starting to, I won't say peter out, but certainly losing a little bit of momentum. So as we have seen the migration trends reverse back, as cities have kind of come out of lockdown, We have seen unemployment rates starting to stagnate both in urban and rural areas. We've also seen signs of Manrega, labor demand declining as well, very early signs. So from that perspective, I would think, like a bigger push is required, but then don't forget that a lot of productivity growth as well has to come from urban areas. So you cannot ignore completely what's happening in urban India, because that's where the bulk of the productivity and a lot of wealth effects are also generated, right? So I think it's a delicate balance, but certainly the rural India recovery or the, sustenance sort of allows the government to have greater degrees of freedom about the policy choices they have to make in the next 6 to 12 months.
The question is, and you're absolutely right, Mr. Bajoria, that no one is saying that urban India does not need to sort of recover. Where I'm coming from is that this bright spark that we've seen because of the very specific and unique circumstances around COVID-19, how does one ensure that this leads to some kind of a revolution beyond increasing Manrega funds or government funds? Do you think there is enough incentive out there for more private investment in your rural areas or your hinterland areas? Because that is what will really drive sustainable growth, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways in which we have realized is that the distancing is something that probably will remain somewhat of a constant in our lives, at least for the next few years. So I think here the role of technology cannot be discounted, right? I mean, technology has been a big enabler. I think a lot of the changes that we have seen, both in terms of the way we interact within businesses and also within, in other areas, I think could be a way in which some of the gains can be pushed towards the rural areas. I think that's one way in which certain, and not just rural, I would say, semi-urban settings as well are the ones which can benefit, where travel and luxury tourism and things like that take a backseat. But then, people might look to kind of branch out and support a different ecosystem, while using technology to stay connected. I think that could be a very interesting theme over the next 3 to 5 years, as people look at alternate work arrangements.
Mr. Balasubramanian, you want to come in on this aspect? Do you see all of this sort of dissipating in the next few months as cities begin to recover? Now we're talking about, rapid action tests. We're talking about a vaccine over the next few months. As those sort of fears ease, people return back to the cities and we go back to business as usual?
I think the first point is, I think that some of the news that we've been hearing of late, like Rahul mentioned, people returning to urban. I doubt if it's, my suspicion is basically it's not because things are starting to look better now. It's probably because you've been to rural, you've been there for a month, and that migration was primarily as a response to the health crisis. But obviously, people don't think of wages and employment when you make a panic move. And then now the situation could be that the agris are absorbing some sort of labor. There's Manrega there. But what about the non-agri rural economy that I just mentioned? So maybe the opportunities that the non-agri rural economy provides is probably not sufficient. And if you remember these pre-COVID days also, like I mentioned, it is on top of the not so great rural wage growth that we had. And most of the people that migrated from rural to urban was mainly because of income issues, and their wages were not great. They couldn't find enough job opportunities. And every year we also see that certain number of people have to move out of agri into higher productivity areas, which could be more in the urban areas. So that is suddenly not going to change. So what one might speak about is a vaccine coming in and all that, but I think the rural spread has just started first of all. So there are states. If you look at the COVID spread, for instance, if you look at the number of days for cases to double, or the positivity rate that is being looked at so often these days, it's all starting to look good at the all India level. But what we suspect is actually it's driven by improvement in a few states. Delhi, for instance, has done really well. But if you look at some of the other states like Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, there has more of rural population. Testing is not up to the mark, particularly in Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal. So it has to pick up. The number of cases incrementally that you see, if you adjust it for population and see the new confirmed cases, it's still rising. So I don't think we are close to the point where a vaccine comes in and immediately the scalability of that again is a question. So I think we are quite far from that. And like I mentioned, we have to keep in mind that rural cannot recur on its own. It doesn't work in a silo. Urban has to recur. Within rural, your non-agri has to recur. So you have to understand how the income, consumption, savings, investment function in a rural economy within these households to take a policy action. Just to give an example, non-agri households is almost less than 52% of rural economy now. And if you look at the savings of the agri households, more agri households, more number of people have savings. But if you look at their average savings, for instance, it's much lower than the non-agri households. And that's because their investments and debt burden is higher, because the line between their personal discretionary investment and your agri-related investment is blurred. And therefore, people invest more there. And the share of debt burden is also higher. So all that is to be kept in mind. And similarly, another point is the employment, that the nature of employment that people get into. So Manrega is one of the key programs. But if you look at for instance, if you look at the NABARD, the All India Rural Financial Inclusion Survey from 2017, it says only around 3.7% of households actually are employed by Manrega. And the wages that Manrega provides is actually around 1/3 of the agri, the wages income that you earn as cultivators, or around 1/4 of the income that you would earn from a non-agri job. So wages and salaries is actually a big contributor to the income for both agri and non-agri households, because in agri households also diversify their sources of income. In fact, more than non-agri households, as per the survey. So all these has to be kept in mind. Only then you can actually come up with a solution, and it has to literally it has to be very nuanced, if you ask me, and not like a one size fits all, which might not actually work.
Absolutely. The important thing is to start talking about it and to formulate policy which doesn't look at rural India just as an extension of what is happening in the agri economy, because then our policy action gets restricted to things like Manrega and increasing MSPs, etc. It is about building sustainable ecosystems out of a situation which has emerged today. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us on this leg of the conversation, and definitely the focus remains on rural India. In fact, the sentiment has been echoed by Rajesh Jejurika, the Executive Director of Auto and Farm Sector at Mahindra & Mahindra, who spoke with ET Now earlier today and talked about how optimistic he is about the festive season really sparkling for his company in rural India.
Rural is the hot topic today, as we all know, and as we've been in the rural segment and watching it very closely, we have seen a distinct uptick, not starting today, but starting sometime December. And we all know that last year rural went through a reasonable amount of slowdown, and starting December, we started to see a much improved momentum. That momentum has been caused by a variety of factors. One clearly has been that last year, the rains got delayed, and that had affected the timing of the sowing, but the rains, when they came in, were really good. The reservoir levels are at a very, very, very good, robust level in most parts of the country, almost everywhere. That builds a lot of confidence, and in a way, monsoon proofs the next season. So that's been one significant positive. The quality and the quantity of the crops that came out last season and again this season in the recent harvesting has both been very good. So that's the other favorable factor from an agriculture point of view. The other significant driver of rural demand has been the government spending. And we've seen, and we have something internally which we call the government spending index. And that's been at a high since Jan-March quarter. And even in the April-June quarter, there's been a significant improvement in government spending across various elements of rural and agriculture. So I think it's a combination of all of these, and farmer output has been good, prices they're realizing are good. So all in all, many positive factors driving rural demand.
Give us a sense as well as to how you're seeing the overall picture shaping up in terms of the farm sector. What are the projections when it comes to farmer spending on buying tractors, buying farm equipment? What has been the demand like?
Yeah, so we have, April, of course, everyone was in shutdown, but end of April, tractor dealers have started opening. May saw a growth, and both June and July have seen a very, very significant growth in the market. We are at close to 100% capacity and still running short of stock. In fact, we opened July with our lowest probably ever system stock at this time of the year, and which includes stock with dealers and stock with us. So even though we are at full capacity right now, we are expecting festival season demand to be very strong. And our major challenge right now is not on the demand front, but making sure we have enough material available as we get into festival season. So, all the positives that I spoke about on the rural demand side are translatable and visible in the tractor demand momentum.
Well, so rural India may be the next bright spark, but right here as we end the show, let's give you a little bit of good news as well. Call it a silver lining of sorts of the coronavirus pandemic, and it's something you perhaps experiencing around you. Due to the COVID-19 lockdown, carbon emissions are predicted to fall by about 8% this year. That's the word coming in from a top official in the Environment Ministry. Now that's great news if we have a drop in carbon emissions. What we have to remember is that as we are unlocking, opening up the economy, are we being sure that we don't go back to the previous high levels of carbon emissions? Can we at least do that and have this big takeaway and lesson from the COVID-19? Well, with that hope, I thank you all for joining us on the show this evening.